I'd like to continue today with our discussion of the flowering plants that we started last time. So we've talked about the life cycle, we've talked about some of the physical characteristics of plants, and that's where of the flowering plants, and that's what I'd like to continue today in looking at some of the physical features so that you can key out and classify to species whenever possible. So again, we're talking about angiosperms or anthophyta. These are both references to the flowering plants. And so as we look at the flowers then in flowering plants, one of the things that's considered in classification is the position of the ovary relative to the receptacle or pedicel. So the superior ovary then would be an ovary that's sitting on or above the pedicel or the receptacle, and an inferior ovary would be one that's embedded within the receptacle or pedicel. Also, an inflorescence refers to a cluster of flowers or a mass of flowers that are being presented by a plant. And so the way that flowers are presented also can be relevant to how they're classified. So as we look at different types of inflorescence, one type of an inflorescence is a spike. And in a spike, flowers directly attached to a central stem. And you're looking at an example here. This is the common mint or horse mint. In a raceme, what we have is an individual flower that's attached to the central stem by means of a pedicel. Again, a substem, if you will, of the flower. And so, again, you'll have flowers attached to the central stem by a pedicel. And an example here, a couple of examples. One would be western monkshood on the left and fireweed on the right. And then a panicle would be where you have a cluster of flowers that share a pedicel attaching to the central stem. And again, this is what that would look like. And this is mountain ash. An umbel is, and this isn't the greatest diagram, but it's basically a circular mass of flowers that attach at a central core then to a common stem. And so this is known as an umbel. And so this is an example of an umbel, and there are a lot of plants like this in the ecosystem. Cow parsnip, this is one actually that is referred to as a hemlock parsnip and is a poisonous plant. So anyway, again, these would be the umbels that you see here. And then last but not least, so-called head flowers or disc flowers. And so here we're looking at a cluster of flowers that are presented on a so-called head, and also this is called a disc. And typically with these kind of flowers, the disc flowers are the fertile flowers. So these will have the stamens and pistils. And then a lot of times you'll have what look like petals radiating around, but these are not actually individual petals. These are actually flowers. They're typically sterile flowers. And we call these the ray flowers. So again, this gets kind of a little more complicated, but these are not just petals. These are individual flowers that have only petals. And then on the disc flowers, this is where the reproductive organs of individual flowers are. So each little spot on the head of a flower like this, a sunflower would be an example. This is the showy fleabane. Each little spot is actually a flower that will develop into a dry fruit and seed. Now, a few other characteristics when you look at leaves, again, how leaf appearance may also influence how you classify. So a simple leaf, basically would be what we're seeing here, as opposed to a compound leaf where the tissue in between the veins has been reduced. And so this would be an example of a compound leaf. And as we look at leaves, again, we will have both blades and petioles as a component of that leaf. And then, again, where leaves are and how they're arranged on the plant. Basal arrangement would be where the leaves are coming out of the base of the plant, at the bottom of the plant, basically at the ground. And this is an example. The buckwheat family is typical of this. Opposite flowers, or excuse me, opposite leaves would be where the leaves come off of the stem opposite one another. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Alternate would be where the leaves come off of the stem in an alternating pattern. So again, as you read descriptions, it will describe the nature of the leaf and whether they're opposite or alternate and so on. And then leafination can also be a clue as to how we classify flowering plants. And so parallel venation would be just that, where the veins are running roughly parallel to one another. Pinnate is where the veins coming off of the raceme kind of look like veins of a feather. So that's a reference to a feather kind of arrangement. So that would be a pinnate arrangement. Palmate is where the veins radiate out from a central point. and this is a gooseberry. And then arcuate is similar to pinnate, except that the veins coming off of the raceme will be slightly alternating, and there's an arch to them as they go towards the margin or edge of the leaf. And so we refer to this as an arcuate type of venation. And again, we'll see that in this example here, one of our disc flowers again. And this is arrowleaf balsam root. Okay, so next thing also, one other thing to look at would be the leaf margin. So the leaf margin would be the edge of the leaf, and an entire margin would be one that's smooth. So as you look at this example again, you can see that there's no tooth-like structures or anything. It's just a smooth edge, so we call that entire. And then there are a lot of options where it's not entire. So again, looking at this example, it's kind of serrated. So again, there's a lot of descriptions here. Some leaf margins would be serrate or dentate or lobate or lobulate. So it can get pretty complicated. And so we're just going to look at this as initially as just being entire or not entire. Okay, now I also want to look briefly at the different types of trees, flowering trees that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So we talked about the conifers, again, which were gymnosperms, but there are also trees that are flowering trees in the ecosystem. Now, they don't produce the kind of flowers that we normally think of as being flowers, but they're flowering plants nonetheless. So one of these would be aspens, and then the other group would be cottonwoods. And when you look at the petiole of the leaf of aspens, the petiole is somewhat oval, whereas in the cottonwoods and poplars, the petiole will be more circular in cross-section. And all of these, by the way, belong to the same genus, Populus, so they're fairly closely related. So again, starting with the aspen, again, the petiole of the leaf, or the leaf stem, if you will, it will be kind of oval in cross-section. And also when you look at aspen, the aspen bark is basically whitish. Aspens are a pretty important tree in the ecosystem. They're an important part of the food chain, and we'll talk more about aspens later, but one of the things that is interesting about aspens is that if you went back 50 years ago, we thought that every aspen that we saw was produced by a different seed. But what we realize now is that actually aspens are produced from underground stems known as rhizomes. And so more than likely, all of the aspens you're looking at in this picture are the product of a single root system and stem system. And so we now refer to this as a clone of aspens. And they would all be genetically identical because they would all be produced by mitotic division. And also, we're seeing a few more young aspens, but I'll talk more about that later. But they are an important part of the food chain in a lot of herbivorous mammals like elk and deer. Now, sometimes the lower portion of the bark of aspens can be pretty ragged looking, and that's because animals will feed on that in the winter. So sometimes elk and deer will browse on the bark of aspens, so it can be kind of rough, usually lower down, but it'll be whitish up above. Now, with the cottonwoods and poplars then, the narrow-leaf cottonwood will have a leaf that's 4 to 5 times as long as it is wide. The poplar, balsam poplar, will have a leaf that's about 2 to 3 times as long as it is wide, and the black cottonwood will have a leaf that's approximately as wide as it is long. And cottonwoods, get their name from the fact that when the seeds are produced, it produces kind of a cottony inflorescence, if you will, and the seeds are kind of cottony and float around all over the ecosystem. Also, some people think it's named from the fact that the wood itself is kind of soft and not very hard. So those are the two reasons why they're considered cottonwoods. Now, another thing I want to mention about some of the flowering plants is that there are some parasitic flowering plants. We don't normally think of plants as being parasitic, but there are a few. And one of the ones that we see up in the Yellowstone ecosystem is known as pine drops. And parasitic plants, in this particular case, it's actually a 3-way relationship. The pine drops actually tap into hyphae of soil fungi. So they'll tap into the mycelia of fungi, and then those fungi in turn are tapping into the root systems of conifers in the ecosystem. So fungi are parasitizing conifers, stealing sugars from their phloem, and then pine drops are tapping into the hyphae and mycelium of underground fungi and stealing sugars from them. So ultimately the source of those sugars traces back to the conifers, but they're working through fungi to get them. And it's typical of parasitic plants, a lot of times they don't have chlorophyll, so they won't necessarily be very well colored. And then another example from the ecosystem is I'm blanking out, is another plant, is mistletoe, pine mistletoe, which is what we find in a lot of the conifers as well. Okay, also, and I'll be talking about this more in the course a little bit later, but there have been a lot of introduced species into the ecosystem. And again, this is problematic. We're going to be talking about what we call trophic cascades. When you bring in a new species, when you take out existing species, this can have a trickle-down effect in the food chain, in the food web. And so alien species are really a problem because if you look at the 1,300 or so flowering plants that we find in the ecosystem, about 200 of those are not native species. And so a lot of times the non-native species will not have the same checks and balances that native species have. So sometimes these are beautiful. This is an example of toadflax. It's an example of one of these alien species. And we do put a lot of money into trying to control these. So there are actually weeding crews that are established every year in the national parks, actually in wilderness areas, national forests as well. And if you are interested in ecological studies or biology, or just want a kind of job where you're working outdoors, these are good summer jobs to get. So again, they'll hire these weeding crews where you go out and basically spray the non-native species, and you're out in the beautiful sunshine all day long. Another example would be thistles. So spotty knapweed, Canada thistle are a couple of examples, and thistles are really taking over the ecosystem as well. So again, these weeding crews are really important to try to keep these alien species down. All right, so next I want to discuss and show you some of the common families that we find, common families of flowering plants that we find in the ecosystem. And understand here that we're just touching the tip of the iceberg. I'm not really going to talk about characteristics of the family so much as just show you some examples, but your lecture outline will talk more about some of the characteristics of these families. And we're certainly not going to get to all the families, but I'll talk about some of them and a few examples from each. So one example of a flowering plant family is the borage family. An example we find up in the Yellowstone ecosystem is the forget-me-not. So this is an example, forget-me-not. Another would be the harebell, and that's in the bellflower family. And it's a pretty common plant. The buckwheat family includes the genus Eriogonum, and so there are a lot of varieties of Eriogonum, all over the country, quite frankly, and we find several species up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and so they'll again have a kind of a characteristic inflorescence that we associate with buckwheats. Another family is the buttercup family. It includes things like the clematis, columbine, which is, again, a spectacular flower. And I think that's one of the things, too, that's interesting about wildflowers. I think most time we think of wildflowers as being kind of small and inconspicuous, but some of the wildflowers are just beautiful, something you could find in someone's garden, quite frankly. Western monkshood, again, another example from this family. And globeflower, as well as buttercups themselves, would also be in this family. All right, evening primrose. The most common example we see is fireweed. And fireweed, as the name implies, is a plant that we see typically after fires. Fireweed will be quite abundant, also in other disturbed habitat. But we really see it throughout the ecosystem, and you'll see coloration vary from kind of a purplish to almost orange. The figwort family, again, quite a diverse group that includes the mullein. And elephant head, which is a flower that we find growing in some of the bogs and wetlands in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And you can see that it takes its name from the fact that it looks a lot like an elephant head. The gentian family. There are quite a few gentians, or I shouldn't say quite a few, but there are a few species of gentians up in the Yellowstone ecosystem. This is the fringed gentian. There's also a bog gentian, but a couple of pictures of fringed gentians. And this is one of the things, too, that can be difficult about classifying flowers, is you can see quite a range in characteristics of leaves and flowers, and even coloration of flowers sometimes. And that sometimes is due to the fact that there's speciation events occurring, but it also may just maybe be due to the type of minerals in the soil and what minerals are being absorbed. And then another family, the mint family. And an example up there is horse mint, common mint, and there's some other members as well. And so this is an example from the mint family. And one of the ways to tell the mints is if you tear the leaf and smell the aroma, it will smell like mints. Geranium family, lots of geraniums up in the ecosystem. We'll see a lot of geranium flowers. So this is the sticky geranium. Also the Richardson geranium would be another example of geranium. The honeysuckle family, there are a few types of honeysuckles up there. The bearberry honeysuckle would be an example. Utah honeysuckle is another. And another thing to keep in mind about all of these flowers that we're talking about is that they will eventually, the ovaries will develop into fruits. So early in the summer when you go up, you're going to be seeing the different types of flowers. As the summer progresses, they transition into fruits of various types. And so many times these fruits are important food sources for animals in the ecosystem, particularly bears. Now, the lily family, there's some spectacular lilies that we find up in the ecosystem. The leopard lily is one that's really pretty rare, in my experience at least to find. It's really a spectacular flower. And then also the glacier lily. So if you get up there early in the summer, later in the summer, if you're at higher altitudes, you might be lucky enough to see the glacier lily. Orchids. Also, we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem. The bog orchid is one that's pretty common. I guess the name implies we do find it in wet areas, boggy type areas. A couple of pictures of the bog orchid. Unfortunately, we're not seeing it flowering out in this particular picture. Pea family, an important family in at a lot of levels. Lupin is probably the most common one that you see up there. We also see a lot of clovers in the ecosystem. Now, the pea family, or legume family, is an important family because if you think back to when we talked about some of the eubacteria, there are eubacteria that are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And I mentioned at that time that some of the bacteria will actually associate with the roots of different types of plants and fix nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, into a usable form, ammonium and then nitrates. And so what happens then is that those nitrates can be utilized by the plant to grow, but typically there's an overproduction of these usable forms of nitrogen, and they'll leach into the soil. So the nice thing about having members of the pea family in your ecosystem is that they associate with bacteria that will be fixing nitrogen, and they typically help fertilize the soil as they grow. The phlox family, a couple of examples here: sky pilot, which is a beautiful little flower, and phlox itself. So the white flower here is actually the member of the phlox family. The pink family includes chickweed. Field chickweed is one that we encounter quite a bit, a little white flower. The primrose family, again, a kind of a spectacular little flower in the primrose family, the shooting star. So again, this is one you're more likely to see early in the summer and as you get to midsummer at higher altitudes, but quite a range of color variation, but really a beautiful flower. Rose family, so again, as you're out hiking, you'll see what looks like it could have come out of someone's garden, the wild rose. Saxifrage family, main example we see here is Parnassia, or grass of Parnassus, another small flower but spectacular looking flower. And then the sunflower family. Again, there are lots of members of the sunflower family: arrowleaf, balsam root, mule's ear, asters, sagebrush, among others. And so these, again, would be examples of the disc flowers that we talked about earlier, or head flowers. And so there are a lot of members of this family, the composite family. So we're looking at ray flowers and disc flowers. And again, a lot of examples in the ecosystem of this, and a lot of them happen to be yellow. Sometimes when we're out in the field, it's hard to distinguish some of these different types. We just kind of refer to them as DYCs, for damn yellow composites. So anyway, some of these are challenging to classify. And this is a showy fleabane. Sagebrush also, we don't see it flowering out here, but sagebrush is a dominant vegetation in the ecosystem, and it also belongs to this family. And then violet family, so we do have some violets that we find in the ecosystem. And then the last family I'll show you is the iris family. And so this is pretty rare. You usually see it in kind of along stream sides and so on, but this is the mountain iris. So again, just to give you a sense of some of the types of flowers you can find in the ecosystem, again, I'll expand a little bit on this in your lecture outline, but keep in mind that the Yellowstone ecosystem is considered a simple ecosystem, yet we're still talking about over 1,000, maybe 1,200, 1,300 species of different flowering plants. So even a simple ecosystem is incredibly diverse. And I think that's one of the great things that I hope you can appreciate if you ever go up to the Yellowstone ecosystem is get off the beaten trail, get off the roads, take some hikes. And I think if you look closely and take your time, you'll be amazed at how much diversity there is when you take a minute and look at the vegetation. All right. So I want to now completely shift gears and now move into animals. And so you may recall, as we look at eukaryotic organisms, we have our 4 subkingdoms. We've talked about most of these already, the excavata, the SAR, the plantae. And we talked about some members of the Uniconta earlier, the fungi. And so now I want to come back to the kingdom Metazoa, which is the animal kingdom. So characteristics of the Metazoa, Metazoa is just another term for animals, so kingdom Metazoa or kingdom Animalia, is that they are multicellular. So animals are truly multicellular organisms. We are heterotrophic, meaning that we cannot make organic molecules from inorganic sources. We have to start with an organic molecule to make another organic molecule. And our cells lack cell walls. Now, when we classify animals, one of the things that we do consider is embryonic development. So embryonic development is an important consideration as we classify animals. So as we follow embryonic development, early development at least, of course, we all start out as a fertilized ovum, the zygote, the diploid cell. And then that zygote will begin to divide. And we call that division cleavage or mitosis, of course. And as cleavage and mitosis progresses, cells' behaviors will begin to change. And so initially we have a solid mass of cells, or a solid disk of cells. It's called a morula. And then that morula will arrange itself, or cells will begin to arrange themselves into a hollow sphere or a hollow disk. And we refer to that stage as a blastula stage. And again, this is pretty consistent throughout the animal kingdom. The blastula stage then will eventually progress to a stage known as the gastrula stage, where the primitive gut begins to form. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. So we're not going to talk about all embryonic stages, but I do want to mention some of these early embryonic stages because there's some important initiations of physical characteristics that start here. So again, lots of different stages from this point depending on what type of animal we're talking about, but most of us share these early stages from zygote to morula to blastula to gastrula. So again, what's happening here is that the zygote divides. That will begin to form a solid mass of cells. Eventually, they arrange themselves into a hollow sphere or disc. That would be the blastula stage. And so this is what the blastulas look like. These are sea urchin blastulas, and certainly we're not going to see any sea urchins in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but it gives you some sense of what this embryonic stage looks like. And then essentially that sphere will indent to create an opening to the outside, basically a cup-like opening. And this is the beginning of the gut formation, and so this would be the initiation of gastrulation, and this would be the gastrula stage in which this occurs. And so here's early gastrulation. We have this beginning indentation in the sea urchin, and this is a little bit later in gastrulation. So as we look at gastrulation, then there are certain things that are happening in gastrulation. One of these, as I mentioned, is gut formation. So depending on the type of animal, there'll be two types of gut. And when I talk about gut, I mean the intestinal tract or intestinal system. So a closed gut is one in which there is a single opening. So a cup-like gut, a cup-like intestine. And again, we won't see these specific examples in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but something like a sea anemone, again, has one opening. Whatever it captures with its tentacles, it would stuff into its cup-like gut and then spit out whatever it can't digest. Jellyfish also have a similar kind of gut, a closed gut. And then an open gut is what you and I have. It's a gut with two openings. So there will be a mouth and an anus. So the gut is not just a cup, it's a tube. And so what's inside the intestine really is an extension of the outside world. The advantage of having this open digestive tract or open gut is that, again, what you're eventually forming is a tube. And so now you can specialize that tube in certain places, take on certain types of specialization. So again, even something like a clam will have a mouth and anus. And again, this complex tube that runs through it. And then the tube can be specialized for specific purposes along the way. So in other words, part of that tube might be all about digestion. Another part of that tube might be about absorption of food materials. And you can be more efficient when you can specialize different regions that way. Now, another characteristic of the gastrula stage is that embryonic tissues begin to form there. And there are three possible embryonic tissues to form, what's known as ectoderm, or the outer skin. Ectoderm will develop into the skin or the cuticle or shell sometimes of a particular animal. Endoderm lines the digestive tract, respiratory tract, so it's a covering kind of tissue, a lining tissue, but we'll find that primarily along our digestive tract initially. And then mesoderm, and organisms that have only ectoderm and endoderm we refer to as being diploblastic. So animals that have only those tissues are diploblastic. And then if you have all three of the tissues, we refer to those types of embryos as triploblastic. And mesoderm is a tissue that will develop into things like blood and bone and muscle tissue. So again, ectoderm would be the outer layers, endoderm lines the gut, mesoderm will kind of fill in the rest of the stuff. And mesoderm will be derived from the endoderm. So typically, yellow represents endoderm, blue represents ectoderm, and red represents mesoderm in these diagrams. And then last but not least, body cavity formation also occurs during the gastrulus stage. So when we look at the possibility of a body cavity, some animals we describe as being acoelomic. So that means that they do not have any kind of a body cavity. And in our next module, we'll begin discussion of these kind of animals. But an example would be members of the kingdom Platyhelminthes, the so-called flatworms. So what we see here is the body wall. And then internally, you can see that there's an opening here. And so this opening is not a body cavity. That's just an extension of the outside world. That's the opening in the digestive tract. So between the digestive tract and the body wall, you'll see that there's no space here. That space we call a coelom. If you don't have the coelom, you are acoelomic. Okay, so the lack of a body cavity between the intestine and the body wall, we call that acoelomic. Some animals we describe as being pseudocoelomic. So they do have a body cavity, but it's not what we consider a true body cavity. An example of an animal like this, again, we'll discuss in our next module, would be a roundworm, a nematode worm. And so here, as you look at this diagram, you can see that they do have a digestive tract. Here's the body wall out here. And there is a cavity there. There is a space there. But what makes it a pseudocoelom is that only the outer body wall is lined by mesodermal tissue. So again, they do have a space, but they don't have a space that's completely lined by mesodermal tissue. Only the outer wall is lined by mesodermal tissue. So they would have muscle and connective tissue out here. And then the most advanced types of animals like you and I are eucoelomic, or have a true coelom, a true body cavity. And so we have our digestive tract running through the body. We do have a body cavity, but there's mesodermal tissue lining and covering our digestive tract and lining the inner surface of our body wall. So again, the concept behind a body cavity, the advantage of that is that organs have room to grow into that cavity and develop. And so evolutionarily, this was thought to be an important adaptation to create space for organ development. So we will continue our discussion of animal characteristics next time. See you then.